I keep trying to look this way, and I'm like,
okay, we're about to begin, so
okay,
you'll hear me in a second.
great. This way.
Good morning, and welcome to today's webinar titled Loss, Grief, and Brain Injury. Our two presenters today are Connie Palmer and Mandy. I'm sorry. So let me introduce first Mandy, who's an MSW. A grief recovery specialist, has been the program director at BIANJ since 2012, overseeing all aspects of program development and management. She graduated from the University of Pittsburgh with a degree in child development and New York University with her master's in social work, and has since earned a certificate in grief recovery and thanatology. She is a lead responder for the Union County Traumatic Loss Coalition and serves on the membership committee for the National Alliance for Grieving Children. Currently, she is doing some short-term work with BIANJ related to brain injury, domestic violence, substance abuse, and veterans. Prior to Imagine, Mandy has worked extensively with patients in hospitals and hospices, as well as in school settings with children with special needs. She lives with her two teen sons and her husband, Adam, who was diagnosed with a brain injury in 2015. And her name is Mandy Zucker. And our second presenter today is Connie Palmer. Connie Palmer is a licensed clinical social worker who is an experienced teacher, therapist, and school counselor with more than 30 years of experience working with youth and their families. She is currently the clinical training director for Imagine, a center for coping with loss in Westfield, New Jersey. She presents seminars on various topics such as grief and loss, resilience, shame, parenting, anti-bullying, depression, and anxiety. So now, with no further ado, Connie Palmer and Mandy Zucker.
So good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having us and for that nice welcome. We're really excited to be working with the Brain Injury Alliance. This is a wonderful opportunity for us. So we hope you enjoy the presentation, but also feel like you're part of it. So there is a section there for you to ask questions. We hope that you do. We would love for this to be interactive. We can talk all day. We're good at that, but we actually enjoy talking with you. So please feel free to ask questions.
Or maybe even share from your own experience, anecdotes or things that will illustrate what we're talking about. It'll just enrich the conversation today.
Absolutely. So I hope you all have handouts and some lists of resources. So you should have gotten something that looks like that. And we will be referencing it today, so you can look at it throughout the presentation. And if you don't have it, we can make sure that you get it at some other point. On page 7, the last page, there are a list of resources. So that's really helpful. We hope that you can use all of those resources. So I want to just briefly tell you a little bit about Imagine, what we do here. We are a free year-round grief support center for children and families who are either living with a life-altering illness or after a death. So we provide support groups ongoing, and they can come for as long as they feel like they need the support. It's not therapy or counseling, because when you're grieving, there's nothing wrong. Not to say that there's anything wrong with therapy. Lots of people will go to therapy in addition. But our program is really focused on normalizing the experience of grief after someone's been diagnosed with an illness or after someone's died. We also do a lot of trainings. That's really what Connie's main purpose is, to do trainings in schools and in agencies, basically anywhere that will listen to us, because we're all grievers. We all know somebody that's either ill or that has died. So she does a lot of that, going into the community, educating people about how to support coworkers, colleagues, children who have experienced a loss. We've done lots of presentations on foster care, on brain injury, on autism. So we will, Connie will present basically on anything, because all of those things, when you've experienced a life-altering diagnosis, there is grief. So if you'd like to learn more about Imagine, we would love for you to come on a tour. We host these 1-hour informational sessions about 3 times a month. You can go onto our website at www.imaginenj.org. And if you slide down about halfway down the screen, there's a little green half circle that says something about taking a tour. And you can register for a tour and come see our center in Mountainside. We would love to show it to you and make sure that everybody in the community kind of knows about it. Yep. So here, today we're going to be talking a lot about the loss that comes with brain injury. So there's lots of kinds of losses. Frequently, I imagine we're talking about death, but we know that really anything that's life-changing comes with loss, even good things. So many of you have probably experienced lots of losses. There's divorce, there's a move, there's breaking up of a relationship, a job loss, an illness. Today we're going to be focusing on the loss due to a brain injury. That's just one kind of loss.
And one of my favorite slides in this presentation is this one, because first of all, who doesn't love finger painting? I do. And also because it really illustrates what loss is like. So if you can imagine that your loss, the loss due to brain injury, is that center circle. So you've had someone you care about, someone in your family, a friend, who's experienced a brain injury, and your life is different now. You've experienced a loss, and the brain injury is the primary loss, but then there are a lot of other things that you lose because of that brain injury, a lot of things that change that may never be the same or may temporarily not be the same. So if you want to type in, I'd love to hear from any of you what some of those other losses have been like if you're a caregiver for someone who's experienced a brain injury. So I have a couple that I can think of, but perhaps you have others. So there may be a loss of a job because your primary job may now be as a caretaker. So there may be a job loss for you as well as perhaps a job loss for a person with a brain injury, which may lead to another loss, which is loss of financial security. And because your way of making money may now be very different. There's also a loss of identity. Who you were before may be very different because of your new role as a caregiver for someone who's experienced a brain injury. So there's also a loss of dreams. So you, and let's say it's your husband or your partner, you had a vision for what was going to happen in your life. You had sort of a movie that you planned out. And now that's something that either is likely to be different or that you need to dream some new dreams. But still the dreams that you've had may not come true, so that's a loss. Also, there's a loss of the relationship you once had with that person. It used to have a certain kind of dynamic and quality to it. You each had different roles, and now that relationship is different. You also may lose other relationships because of that loss. We're going to talk more about that as we illustrate what this kind of loss due to brain injury is like and how it affects people. So that's the losses, the secondary losses that affect the person who's the caregiver or the friend, family member of the person with the brain injury. But then the person with the brain injury also has losses. So their initial and primary loss is the brain injury. And their experience of that loss, it may be delayed. The people around that person may be much more aware of what the loss is looking like. People with brain injury often have unawareness, so their sense of the reality of their functioning may come to them later than it does to the people around them. But still there is loss, so they also have a loss of identity. Who they were before professionally, personally, in the marriage may be forever different or in that relationship. The dreams that they had may no longer be possible. There is a loss of freedom and a loss of privacy often, a loss of control. And again, losses in relationships and in that financial area. So you could probably think of more, and again, I invite you to share some of those with us today because you're experiencing it right now.
The other thing I would also comment on, we haven't really mentioned children, but the children in the family will also experience losses because if it's a parent that's experienced the brain injury, obviously their role may be different. They may interact with that person differently. And also the person with the brain injury may not be able to parent in the same way that they had been. So they can, the person with the brain injury may experience that loss as well as the rest of the family.
That's a really good point. And the other reason I like this slide is life isn't always very polite. Sometimes you have other losses that are going on at the same time as the experience of brain injury, or losses that have preceded it. So you're caring for someone with a brain injury and your mom develops Alzheimer's, or you lose your job. So you can see in this image of these ripples that multiple losses can be happening. And the other way I love to look at this image is that in a family or in any group of people, my loss is going to affect the other person's loss. So we're going to literally bump into one another in the midst of that loss, and that will have an impact on us. So we have an illustration that Mandy's going to do for you, and which illustrates what loss is like when you've experienced a brain injury.
So this is my box of dominoes. I hope you guys can see that. This is a representation of my life. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about my life. I'm going to bring you back about 3 years ago, and each domino represents an aspect of my life. So right here at the very top is my mom domino. Always has been right there on the top. I have 2 kids. 3 years ago they were in 8th and 6th grade. And then I have lots of other pieces. Also close to the top is my job domino. I have a great job that I love. I'm a wife, and I have a great husband. And lots of other things that I like to do. So there's my exercise domino and my baking domino and my book club dominoes down here, and lots of things in my life to sort of make it up. It's pretty neat. They're kind of lined up in rows. It's not perfect, but that's kind of a representation of my life. I also like to take good care of myself. I have this ritual somewhere in here. In the morning, after my husband leaves for work and my kids leave for school, I have about an hour that I get to myself. And I have developed a very nice morning ritual. I have a piece of toast and my egg, and I have a little date with the Today Show, and it's really like my self-care. And then my husband was diagnosed with a brain injury. And my life shattered, as did his. All of the pieces of my life are gone. That day, my son was asking Rachel Harvey to the 8th grade formal. And I very quickly picked up my mom domino. Hadn't even quite been diagnosed yet, and I picked up my domino because I had to get those flowers to the school because we had a whole plan for her that day. So I put that domino right back in my box. Work, they were really good at my work. I took a few weeks off to take care of him, figure out what was going on, but I came back to work pretty quickly. So that domino also went back in. All of the dominoes are not back in my box yet. They're still kind of, some of them I'm still figuring out. Some of them I've decided will never go back in. They're just not important in my life anymore, or can't fit in my life at all. But I just, I do that demonstration because I think it shows, how shattering a brain injury can be in someone's life. But whose job is it to pick up the dominoes, to pick up the pieces of my life? When you know someone that this has happened to, or perhaps when it's happened to you, whose job is it to pick up, all of the pieces of our lives? The truth is, it's mine. I think many of my friends, my family, they wanted to pick up the pieces. They wanted to make my life go back to normal. But the reality is that they can't do that. I wish that they could. There were things that they could do, right? They could drive my kids to school, and Adam needed help getting to rehab, and they drove him there, and the food and the meals that showed up at our doors, all of those things were really helpful. But figuring out my life is really my job. That's my grief work. It's nobody else's job. The other thing that, I mentioned, this was about 3 years ago when he was diagnosed. How long should I get before all the dominoes are back in my box? It's a question I think that people, ask all the time. It's been a year already. Get yourself together, figure this out. The reality is that grief is a lifelong process. So we don't get to decide how long it's going to take before I figure everything out. Some things, like I said, I figured out very quickly. And then other things I'm still figuring out. I'm still trying to fit all of the pieces of my domino together. And the truth is, with the brain injury, it doesn't just, your dominoes don't just shatter one time, because there may be complications or, those ripple effects that you were talking about, that they fall and then you put a few back in and then they might fall out again. So the time thing is critical to understand that there is no time to figure all of that out.
So, and I think one of the things that happens is we feel, even though there is no time, as Mandy says, we feel pressure.
Yeah.
We feel like, I got to get them back in, and people around us maybe think, come on, you got to get back to your old life, move on. And I think that pressure is part of why we do these workshops, so that you understand that experience of picking up those dominoes, of reclaiming your life in a very different way than it was before takes time. And there's a process involved. And we're going to talk about so it's Mandy's job to pick up the dominoes, but there's a job for the people around her about how we can support her when she goes through that. We do have a question that came in. I wanted to share that. So it says here, I have a child with a brain injury that I need to spend a great deal of my time with. Are there any strategies or resources for siblings of someone with a brain injury? So one of the things that, depending on their age, we're going to talk in a second about what those siblings are experiencing, which is grief. Mm-hmm. They are impacted by this loss in perhaps a different way than you as a parent, but they're definitely impacted. Their sibling is different. Their relationship with that sibling is different, and their relationship with their parents is now different. So I think you're picking up on the fact that you're trying to figure out, how can I also support my other children, even though I have to spend so much time with my child, because that's definitely part of that domino. You've got to pick that up and put that caregiver domino back in your box. But you're also in the process of picking up, your relationships with your other children. So one thought I have is, I know it's just a very practical one. I know Children's Specialized Hospital has groups for siblings of people with any kind of life-altering developmental or injury. So that might be a resource for them to be with other kids who've had that experience, depending on their age. And I think the only other piece that occurs to me, and maybe Mandy has some ideas, is that to acknowledge their loss, that this is different for them, and that you're doing the best you can, but you can't make it be like it was before. And I think just acknowledging that that's the new reality that you all live with, that you will need to spend more time, perhaps, and there's sort of an unfairness that children will unnecessarily feel. But the unnecessary part is that sense of, we want to be able to do it all. Yeah. And I think one thought is to be able to spend special time to create that, we're going to go out and it's just going to be Mom and you, and what would you like to do? So that quality time, you may not be able to give them the same quantity, but to be able to give them that special time where it's just you and them. Do you have any other?
Well, my other thought is just that, we don't have it yet here at Imagine, but through our Coping with Illness program, we are trying to create a group for siblings, and we hope to actually start that in September. So if you're interested in something like that, you can certainly give us a call over the summer. We have a small waiting list, and as soon as it's big enough, we are ready and able to start a group for siblings here as well.
Right. And then we have another comment here from Julianne, and she says, are there any tips for letting yourself off the hook when caregiving means you can't do everything you used to. Oh, so I don't know, my heart goes out to you. That feeling of, trying to be all things, and when you're a caregiver, the amount of energy that takes, and our standard of what we used to be able to do and how much energy we have is now different. And I think, I don't think I necessarily have any tips other than just that sense of being kind to yourself, that you're doing the very best you can. And in reality, it sometimes is creating that time where you can refill, and so that you can stay in that role of caregiver, as well as trying to do, choosing some of those things that you really do need to do, and all that juggling that is now part of your life.
I was just going to also say that, as a mom, I think that is a very universal experience.
Mm-hmm.
Brain injury, no brain injury. Moms often feel like they can't do everything. And we're always feeling pulled in different directions between work and home responsibilities. So obviously a brain injury is going to just compound that, especially if there are other children who you're trying to parent at the same time. I think, I know I'm biased about support groups because I think they're so valuable, but being with other people to be able to talk about how, the guilt and the regrets that people feel, I think can be so helpful. So if you can find a support group, I think it's a great place to talk about, all of those kinds of things. Of course, I think finding a support group sometimes is hard because you're caregiving and it's hard to get away to go to a support group. And I hate to even say, do more for yourself because it just adds the pressure and the stress of, so now I have to care for him and go to a support group, and it sometimes can feel even more stressful. But if you can try it frequently, if you can take that hour or so to yourself, you do feel more present. You are able to be more available to the people that need you when you're there. They say that all the time for people who work, to take a 15-minute break will actually make you more productive at work. So if you can squeeze in, some time once a week, every other week, it will make you a better caregiver, if you could possibly do that.
We talk at Imagine, we have facilitators who run our support groups who come from the community, and one of the things we talk about is, putting on your own oxygen mask before you put it on for others. And, I think that that's counterintuitive. If we're caregiving, we're, giving out, putting the oxygen mask on everyone else. And I do think, even though we don't want to add it as a list of shoulds at all, but more as an encouragement and an empowerment to claim some of that time so that you can keep doing the best you can, being good enough in that role, which is now, your lives are different and that you're navigating it absolutely the best you can. So when that domino box falls, you have a loss, and the reality of that loss is that you are going to experience grief. So grief is all the feelings that you have inside whenever you have a loss. And it's the experience of it, and it's that internal one. So if I was to, if I went out of Imagine today and I said, okay, everybody who's grieving, put on a T-shirt so I can tell who's grieving, everybody would have one on, because we're not just talking about the fact that death creates grief, but there's so many other things that create grief that we experience. So we want to think about, first of all, what are some of those grief beliefs? Because when we have grief, there's a lot of beliefs, some of which are really healthy and helpful, some of which are not helpful and kind of add to our suffering. So perhaps you can feel free to weigh in on some of those beliefs that you have about your grief. One of them is in the picture here on the PowerPoint, is that there's stages to it. So there's denial and anger and bargaining and depression and acceptance. This was actually created by a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who studied dying people. And these were the stages of facing into your mortality after a diagnosis perhaps a terminal diagnosis. And I think what happens, though, is we've learned, our grief belief is that it happens in stages, that there's this step-by-step process that we go through and that it's linear. And the reality is that that is not how grief works. It doesn't mean you won't have denial or anger or depression or come to an acceptance, but they don't happen step by step. And you know, I wonder what some of the other beliefs some of you might have. One of them that we hear a lot here is time heals all wounds. So, you know, what we believe is a more healthy belief about grief is that it's what you do with that time. So how will you find places and people who can support you in this loss that you've experienced? And that the time, the healing does happen in time as we go through that experience of grief. It looks like you have a couple other comments here.
Yeah, I'm just reading a lot of comments about caregiving and how difficult it is to take care of yourself. I should get a little closer to I didn't bring my readers, which I'm not, I haven't accepted the loss of my eyesight yet. The normal milestones that my child may not reach, such as getting a job, getting married, etc., when my friends' children are reaching these milestones and my child is not.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge loss, and the grief of that is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, this is one of the things about grief is that it really looks like this image. So this is what we feel is sort of a healthy grief belief. We would all like the grief after a death, after a brain injury, to look like the image on the left. We want it to have a nice beginning point and an ending point. And there are some losses in life that are like that, but most major losses look a lot more like the image on the right, where there's a beginning point. So that, and when Mandy shared her story of that day when she recognized, came to the awareness that her husband had a brain injury, there was that squiggly, you know, snarled experience of grief. And then there is an arrow in the end. And the arrow it says that grief continues. It may change, but that there is that experience of loss that may continue into the future.
Some people like to say that grief is like the weather. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the weather, we have no control over it. We don't get to pick if it's going to be a sunny day or a cloudy day. We can control some of it. If we know it's going to rain, then we might, you know, make sure to have an umbrella or wear our rain boots that day. But we don't really get to control the grief. It just happens. We always say it's just an is. It just is. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything about it. So if we know it's one of those days, then maybe that's the day we're going to reach out to a friend for coffee. That's the umbrella that we might need that day. Or maybe it's, you know, that we're going to go to a support group. Today's the day I'm going to force myself out of the house because I'm just really feeling like I need something. So those are the kinds of things that we can do to not to control the weather, but to come up with a strategy for coping with the weather. That is grief. The other thing, if you look at page 2 and 3, no, that's too far. Okay, sorry. 2 and 3 of your handout, there's what we call a Bill of Rights. Connie put these together, and I think they're really powerful. So there's a Bill of Rights for the person with the brain injury or with an illness. And then on the next page, there's the Bill of Rights for family and friends who are grieving when somebody's been diagnosed with a brain injury. Because we all have these rights. We are allowed to have our feelings. And so often people, you know, you don't associate the word grief with an illness or an injury, right? People so often think grief is when somebody dies. But when we experience a loss of any kind, we grieve. And we are allowed to have those feelings. And I think these Bill of Rights really gives people the sense of permission. Oh, I'm grieving. I am experiencing a loss. And it's valuable. And, you know, it's valid. So please use these, put them on your refrigerator, give them out to people that you know are going through something. I think they can be really helpful to people.
Yeah, and we do, if you, we could make this available to you, Laura. We do have a grief bill of rights for kids. So if you have kids in your home, getting that grief bill of rights into their hands so that they're recognizing that how they're experiencing this event is a loss, and that grief and all those feelings that they have is normal. So if you could take a look with me on page 4, find that in your handouts. So one of the grief beliefs, and I think this was really pointed out in one of the earlier comments, is that when we have a loss and we have this normal but painful experience of grief, one of the grief beliefs we have is that there's something wrong with us, that we should buckle down and be able to just outrun this grief, overpower it, get back in control. And that's really tempting to do and understandable because it's painful and the brain injury itself makes you feel incredibly powerless and out of control. But that experience of judgment, either from yourself after this loss or from other people, is what we would call shame. And that experience of shame is, I'm doing something wrong, I'm not working hard enough, I should be able to do my life the same way I did it before the brain injury. And that some of those beliefs, what we're encouraging you to do is to challenge that. So if you look at page 4, one of the things that I say when I go out and do workshops is loss changes how you get dressed in the morning. So what do I mean by that? So normally you put your pants on, you put your shirt on, and you go to work or go out of your home. But when you've had a loss, without knowing it, you put your pants on, you put your shirt on, and you put your mask on. Because going out into the world after a brain injury, after any kind of major loss, you feel exposed. You've got, as Mandy said, that grief, which is like the weather, can just all out of the blue just blow in a big wave of grief. And we feel often exposed. We feel like there's something wrong with us if we can't control those feelings. So there is this experience of shame where we put that mask on so that people can't see all of who we are behind the mask. And sometimes that's exactly right to do because sometimes it isn't safe to with a certain group of people to share what you were going through. But one of the things that I think Mandy experienced, correct me if I'm wrong, Mandy, is that when you came to work, it wasn't like you had to hide it. You could come to work and be sad and have all your feelings, at least as much as possible, and get support for that. That's not true in every workplace. That's not true in every family and every relationship. So what we encourage you to do is find places where you can take your mask off. The other thing that I think is just a little bit of an awareness is that this is unconscious. When after an event like a brain injury or a death, you're in survival mode. You're doing the very best you can. You're trying to cope based on previous ways of coping. And what we are, one of the things that happens when that shame hits us, like I'm not working hard enough, I'm not trying hard enough, I got to try harder to control all these feelings that I'm having of grief, is that there's 3, if you take a look at number 3 on that page, there's 3 different kinds of masks that people tend to put on. And it's autopilot. You don't even realize you're doing it. And this is a way to keep people from seeing what's behind the mask, what's on the other side. So the first one is an anger mask. So I go around being hostile and angry and aggressive and sarcastic. If I'm acting like that, people can't see the vulnerability and the grief and the pain on the other side of the mask. A second type of mask is the flight mask. So if my grief is this way, I'm going to try to make other people look up the other way and distract them. I'm going to, try to be the perfect parent. I'm going to try to be the perfect wife, or I'm going to be, try to be a perfectionist in all things and have people not see that part of me in any way I possibly can. I also might pull away from relationships so people don't see that part of me. And then the third one is sort of the caregiving mask. So in order to keep people from seeing what's behind my mask, I double my efforts at taking care, putting those dominoes back in the box, caring for the person with the brain injury, caring for myself, family members. And I think what we're hoping for is that whether it's in a support group or a good friend or, in your community, that you seek out people where you can take your mask off. Keep it on with people where it isn't safe, where they're going to be judging you, but to find places where it's never going to be perfectly safe, but places where you can take it off and get support.
I was just thinking, when I did that domino exercise, I dropped the dominoes, and it made this very loud sound. And I think Connie, even though she knew I was doing it, we did practice this webinar. She knew it was coming, but she jumped a bit. And I looked at her and I said, I'm sorry.
Oh.
And as soon as I said it, I thought, why did I just apologize? It was as if I did something wrong, like I upset Connie, right, by making you jump, and I'm sorry, and I shocked you. When you say sorry for your feelings, right, that's just my life. That's my experience. And apologizing for that really is kind of saying, something's wrong. I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry for sharing this story with you and making me, surprised by that. And that is that feeling of shame that I am putting out something in the world that, doesn't make other people feel good. And Connie's a wonderful support. So,
but it is that sense of like there's either people are going to judge me, so I got to keep my mask on, or that I feel like my grief and my experience is a burden to someone, and I should be handling it all on my own.
You have this other comment that, again, I don't have to read.
Okay, so Cheryl is saying, as a clinician, I sometimes find it difficult to help my clients adjust to their quote-unquote new normal and develop insight into their post-injury strengths and limits. Caregivers and family members can complicate this when they, too, are having difficulty accepting the new normal on the part of their loved ones. So we're scrolling down, hopefully. Thank you, Mindy. We're eventually going to get your whole comment here, Cheryl. So do you have tips for, okay, we can't quite see the bottom of the comment, but do you have tips for, okay, sorry about that. Okay, let me just read through what we can see. Do you have tips for navigating this, how to help the caregivers accept what's happened? One of the things that, accepting reality is painful. So when I accept the reality of this new normal, which is, some people really don't like that term, when you accept that, you're going to feel pain. You're going to feel grief. And as human beings, we protect ourselves from facing into that reality. So I think you've exactly captured the reality of that struggle that you have of helping them accept this new reality. And I think one of the things that we realize here at Imagine when we deal with grief after an illness or a death is that there's a timing to being able to face into the reality of what my life will be like now. And I think that there are, I think letting people have their feelings, like what would it be like to face that pain, that this may be the new reality of your life. And, there's a timing to that I wish we were in control of. I don't know if you have any comments or thoughts on that, but I think that you've hit on the struggle that, we as people around someone whose experience this are in, is that there's a process where the dominoes are being picked up, one by one, and the process of sort of facing into that takes time.
Sarah also made a comment. It says, as a caregiver who is a control, I think you said freak, how do you deal with the fact that you can't fix it? We're going to talk a little bit about fixing versus grief. So grief is not something that you can fix, but there are things that we can fix, and we are going to talk a bit more about that. So I think there's another comment, but we're going to want to look at that while on. Is this me?
Yes.
Okay. So grief affects us in many ways. You see all of them listed here. So obviously it's an emotional reaction, grief. It's all of the feelings that we have when we lose anything that we care about or that's significant in our lives. It can affect us cognitively as well because it takes up so much emotional and mental energy that it's hard to focus on other things. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of going back to work or trying to get back into something, reading a book. People talk about that all the time, how difficult it is to concentrate and how reading is like off the table now. But probably many of you have experienced that going back to work and not really being there, being there but not actually being able to get your work done. It really does affect, how much energy and how much of our brain power we have to focus on cognitive tasks. Physically, lots of people will talk about stomach aches, headaches, heart palpitations, lots of things like that that really make it difficult for them. We suggest obviously checking that out physically. If you're having some kind of physical symptoms, go to the doctor. But oftentimes, when we don't express the grief externally, we manifest all of those feelings internally. So we will have lots of aches and pains and
Trouble sleeping and
sleeping,
wanting to eat too much or not enough. Yeah.
I was going to say I've never had the not enough problem, but some people apparently have had that. Obviously, it can affect our relationship with God, if we believe in God, so our spiritual lives can be very much altered. Either way, I've had people who have talked about how, they had a very strong faith, and this has just shaken their world, and they can't believe in a higher power that would do something like this. And then other people have felt like maybe they didn't have a very strong faith, and that has been the grounding factor in their lives right now. So we talked a bit about the relational changes that occur when we're grieving. Grief is so universal, it happens to all of us, and yet it is so intensely personal and individual. So, I wish that we could all just say we're grieving the same loss and that connects us, but not necessarily, because none of us are grieving the exact same loss. It could be one person in a family, but that person has a different relationship with each person in their family. Each person in the family has their own mental health issues, and they're at different places developmentally and cognitively in their lives. So it really affects each of us differently. Behaviorally, everything we do, really, the way that we act is a reflection of how we're feeling. So we all will respond in a behavioral way to our grief. It's very easy to point it out in children and tell them, if their behavior is good or bad. Adults do the same thing. So sometimes, we'll eat too much, we'll shop too much, we'll sleep too much, we'll yell at the dog, there's lots of things that we do to sort of show how we're feeling through our behavior. So it affects us in all sorts of ways, many of which we don't even realize are happening at the time.
And if you've got that mask on, where you're not letting people see, I think it more comes out, sort of leaks out of us in our behavior. So we also want to think a little bit about the fact that when we grieve, when we have all those feelings of grief, the goal is to be able to mourn, to express those feelings, to find places where we can take the mask off. And the reason I like this image of the sun breaking through these dark clouds is that grief, when you're handling it by yourself and you're isolated, is extremely painful and isolating. But when you can find safe places or ways to express that grief and get support, literally like the light breaks through. And I want to think a little bit about, what happens when we don't mourn? So if I hold all the feelings inside of my grief, and I think initially it's kind of normal to do that because you're in survival mode, so you're just, pushing through, especially right after the diagnosis and the reality of whatever triggered the brain injury. But if that keeps going, Mandy's already talked about how it affects our bodies, but it also affects our mental health. We see people developing depression, developing anxiety, and getting sick, and sometimes developing, addiction, substance abuse, things that they're using to try to cope with the pain of this loss. When I first led a workshop for BIANJ back, I think it was in 2013, Laura can correct me, I presented just exactly what Mandy and I are presenting today, and I got this email from this mom, and I got permission from her to share this letter. I'll give you a second to read it. But what I think happened for her in this workshop is that she was realizing the grief that she was experiencing because her son, while he was alive, was different. And it actually gave her permission to feel like she could live again, to feel like, the feelings I'm having are normal and I can express them, and there's nothing wrong with me for missing my old son, and that would be a normal experience of grief. And I think she was hearing a lot from people like, oh, don't be upset, your son's alive, you should be grateful for that. when the reality is she has that right to grieve. And I think that was, I think, this moved me really to tears when I read it, just the power of what having that grief normalized can do for us. So then we're going to get to the, what do we do? How do we as people get support and also give support?
Absolutely. So, I mentioned that there are things that we can fix, and that is, thank God there are things that we can fix, but grief is unfortunately not one of them. The way that we heal grief is by letting people experience it. And we at Imagine, we use a model called the companion model. It's not a treatment model. Treatment is wonderful, but when somebody's feeling something emotional, the goal is not to treat them. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just experiencing feelings. So we want to companion them through their loss. So Connie and I maybe can review. So if you're looking at page 5, you'll see the whole companion model. I just captured a few of them on this slide. So I'm going to just, because hearing them out loud, I think makes this very powerful. So I'm going to read the black and then you'll read the red. Mm-hmm. Companion is about being present to another person's pain. It is not about taking the pain away. Companion is about discovering the gift of sacred silence. It is not about filling every painful moment with words. Companion is about bearing witness to the struggles of others. It is not about directing those struggles. Companion is about going to the wilderness of the soul with another human being. It is not about thinking you are responsible for finding the way out. So if you think about the word companion, it's someone who is on a journey with you. They're walking at your pace. They're listening to you. They're, you're following them. You're walking together. Mm-hmm. And I think that often what people do when they're walking alongside someone who's grieving is they're behind them pushing them, or in front of them dragging them, or above them judging them. Which are all very tempting things to do. I've done those things for sure with the grieving people in my life because it feels so powerless. And I'm watching that person be in pain, so I want to help the best I can. And it, I think to the point of the person who was talking about how she helps people face the new normal, there's a timing to this that we're not in control of. And yet we have treatment plans and treatment goals that make us feel like, okay, I've got to move this person along. But often that makes us slow down, is what I found. When people are trying to fix someone who's grieving or make them get to face a certain reality, they're going to face that reality in the time that they're going to face it. And I hate that because I'd like to be able to be in control of the timing of that. So what we also want to think about is that we have some skills. So, and this is, we have these not only for you to use for the people in your life, or you're supporting, let's say you're a mom and your kids are grieving the loss of their dad having a brain injury. But this is also what you're looking for in a companion. It's sort of like a job description. Like, what is that person going to be acting like? So I'm going to hear a little bit about 1 through 5. So first one is you want to have empathy. You want to help the person who's grieving feel like, as much as possible, you get what they're experiencing. And I get it.
Yeah, but that because you really never fully understand. You can never really say, "Oh, I totally get it," or "It happened to me." But that you are saying things back to them that show that you have some compassion and some empathy for their experience. So seeing your dad be so different is really hard. So saying something that captures what they've shared with you, and sometimes that doesn't even involve words. The second thing is you want to let the person have all their feelings, and that's tough. So certain feelings, there might be, well, if I'd only done this, the person wouldn't have the brain injury. And what do we want to say if someone says that? We want to say, no, don't feel that way. You did the best you could. But what if I need to talk about that regret and that guilt that I have? You've just closed that conversation. So we want to let the person have all of their feelings. You can say, it's really painful for me to hear that. You feel that guilt. But we want to let them have that feeling and have a place where they can take off that mask and not have to hide that part of themselves. And I think number 3 is so important. So if people behave how they're feeling inside, that's just a fact of all of us as human beings. So, but that behavior can drive us nuts. And sometimes we're the ones who are behaving our feelings. So when you see that, rather than judge, just stay curious. Like, I wonder why I'm acting like that. Why am I so irritable? Or why is my child acting out so much? It's because they're trying to convey something, and we want to listen to that behavior and see it as information about the person's experience. However, you want to set limits and boundaries. If kids are mad, they can't come up and kick you. You can say, you're really mad. I wonder if there's some ways that we can talk about those feelings of anger and not have you kick me. And if you kick me again, here's what will happen to you. And number 5 is probably the most important thing. We want to follow the grieving person's lead. So what that means is we go where they want to go and at the pace that they want to go. This is very counterintuitive for us as human beings. I struggle with this all the time, especially with my children's grief, because I feel very responsible for making them feel better. And I want to cheer them up. I want to solve it for them. And the reality is that when people we care about are grieving, we want to be there for them at whatever particular point they are at their pace. So I might say, I want my kid to talk about it. You need to talk about this. Maybe they don't want to talk about it with me. Maybe there are other people who can support them.
And then, as we're listening to them, as we're companioning them, we want to avoid problem solving or giving advice. Frequently not helpful. Unless they ask, I need some advice about, what doctor to see or something. But otherwise, when they're sharing emotional information, when they're talking about their feelings, most of the time people are not looking for advice or how to feel different or better. They really just want somebody to listen to them. Which brings me to the next, number 7, ask yourself, why am I talking? So when you're about to say something, wait and ask yourself, why am I talking? Is it because I'm curious, because I think I can solve something for them? Because really, most of the time, they just need you to be quiet and listen to them. So ask yourself that question and maybe wait an extra 10 seconds before you say something, because it might lead them to share something else that's been on their mind, and it gives them that opportunity to do that. So we talked about getting support for yourself. Support groups are one of those ways. There's lots of ways you can make sure you get support. Support groups are time-consuming. You have to get there, you have to get back, you have to be there for the whole time. But there are other ways as well. There's, journaling, taking a walk outside, just around the block, getting good sleep, exercising. There's all sorts of things that you can do, and I'm sure many of you have some better suggestions than I do about what to do for yourself. But the other thing is that, I talked about before how, we put pressure on ourselves feel better in certain time frames. But the reality is there is no reward for getting there faster. It really is up to each person. I remember driving to work one day about 6 months after my father had died. At the time I was working in a hospice, and I was about to go on a support group, a bereavement group, and I was crying in the car, and I said to myself, Mandy, stop crying. It's been 6 months already. And then I thought, oh my God, I'm about to walk into a support group where I'm going to tell people there's no time frame for grief. But I was putting a time frame on myself as if I should be feeling better in 6 months. I had my dad for 29 years, and all of a sudden I'm supposed to feel 6 months and that's enough time, and I should be better. So sometimes people put pressure on ourselves, and sometimes we put pressure on ourselves. And then also this idea that we're attached to an outcome. We want for people. We want for the people that we care about. So we want them to get to a place. But the reality is that it's not our job to determine what, a good outcome is for them. They get to decide what they need. So, sometimes we'll say, oh, we just want them to come in and cry. I've had lots of parents that will call and say, my kid's not talking about it, and I need him to come in and start talking about it. That may or may not be what's helpful for that child. We want to be careful about, putting some expectation that this is the right thing. Each person knows. We really do. We all know what we each need, and we are our own experts. Nobody else.
Yeah, and I think that when we're in the role of caregiver or a therapist or a counselor, there's some definitely things where we're measured by that outcome. People are judging us, and I think that's one of the things that I thought was so counterintuitive about this, is that if I sat with Mandy 10 times and she needs to tell a story about what it's like on the face of the diagnosis of their husband having a brain injury, and I'm like, well, it's been 10 times, Mandy, come on, aren't you kind of, move past me and tell the story over and over again? That she's, I haven't questioned that because I want to feel like I helped her. Yeah. I want you to show some progress, Mandy. Thank you. But, I think that's a really tempting thing to feel with someone. And just going back to number 7 for a second, what is helpful to say and not say? So why, the kind of 2 reasons I feel like there's anything to say. I'm a talker. So when I get anxious or I feel out of control, I just talk. So the reason for us to talk when we're helping someone feel felt is to help them say more and to show them that we get it, right? That we have heard them, that we have a sense of what they're experiencing. And those are really the only reasons we want to say anything. Mandy, I work with a lot of very supportive people, and often I'll tell them something all she has to do is make this very compassionate face. And I'm like, okay, she gets it. So often words are not even necessary. So it looks like any of you, we've got a couple more minutes for some questions, but I just want to flip to the last slide and definitely send us some any questions or comments. I love this quote. If any of you have not read Claudia Osborne's book, Over My Head, I don't know, I feel like it's a life-changing book. So when I first was doing the these loss and brain injury, I read this book, and it really illustrates the grief of the person with the brain injury. Claudia Osborne was a doctor, a very, very high-level doctor who had a bicycle accident, and she wrote this book both about her grief and her family's grief. And I love what she says here, that it's not the new normal so much as my life now. And I love that there's new parts of me that are developing if I've had a loss, a brain injury. And there's also old parts of me that I'm going to come back and get reacquainted with, and that I can use that are strengths that I have. And this quote, often she felt people were judging her based on who she was. But she was really beginning to value some of these new parts of her. I remember she was kind of a workaholic, and she was like, now I like to sit and paint and bake and do all these other things.
I also found this book to be very helpful to give to other people who don't live with a person with a brain injury, just to help them understand what some of the things that people with a brain injury are going through.
Right. And I want to acknowledge BIANJ and their sponsors as we end. First, I love this slide because it shows what's needed when the down is fall. We need love around us. We need a lot of safety, people who are going to be companions and walk through us as we pick up some of the dominoes and then some of them stay on the floor. And BIANJ, I have to say, has taken the lead on acknowledging that that a brain injury is a loss. That's a new idea. It shouldn't be, but it's really a new idea that when people are going through the loss of a brain injury, that they're going to have grief. And we want to acknowledge the corporate circle of partners for supporting BIANJ, and a special thank you to Laura and Chris, who helped us with the technology, setting us up here today. We do have one more minute if anybody has any final comments or questions. We're just so glad to have been with you, and what you shared just made the conversation so much more rewarding for me, definitely. Thank you.
You can always reach out to us also at Imagine. Reach us at either Connie or I, just search names at imaginenj.org.
Right, and our emails are on the front of your packet if you've had any questions. And we do encourage you to come and see our center. And if you know of other places where we can do workshops in the area, whether it's on loss, grief, and brain injury, or whether it's any of the workshops that we do, we go into schools and companies and community organizations, churches, mosques, temples, because I think we're all doing the work of trying to support people who are grieving. And Tara has a final comment, which looks like a really appropriate one for us. Today is the 1-year anniversary of my spouse suffering a TBI. I'm grateful to have him here with me. Thank you for the webinar.
Tara.
I think that's a perfect way to close off on this. At this point, I'd like to thank both Connie and Mandy from Imagine for taking time out of their busy schedule to present such a wonderful and informative webinar. Thank you. This webinar will be on our website, BIANJ.org, within a week, along with the handouts that they provided. Our next webinar on technology will be on August 22nd at 10:30 a.m. And again, my name is Laura Jacobs. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. Thank you so much to both of you. And at this time, we have come to the close of our webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.